And joining us now, Demir Delen. He is the former president of the Canadian Turkish Association, and we're grateful you could come into TVO tonight and help us with this as well.
Thank you.
Our previous guest, Aris Babikian, has called the events that took place 94 years ago the Armenian genocide. What do you call the events that took place 94 years ago?
Well, genocide is a very powerful and legal word. At least I don't call it genocide, but we acknowledge the death and suffering of hundreds of thousands of Armenians in tragic events that happened during war, the First World War in Eastern Anatolia, which is part of Turkey right now. And what maybe Mr. Babikian is saying, or most Armenians are trying to put, is just one side of the story where obviously the Armenian deaths, but there's at least equal amount or more of Turkish and Muslim people who died in the region at the same time during this conflict. And when you acknowledge those and look at those, they're tragic events that we really have to learn from it, get lessons out of it, so that these kind of ultra-nationalist behavior that caused total uprooting of families and communities do not happen again.
Well, you're right, words are powerful, but that's why I want to understand what words you use. They say Armenian genocide, what do you say?
Well, I don't use a genocide because genocide means that there is an intent to destroy a racial, national, religious, ethnical group.
I get that. I'm going to come to that. What do you call it, though?
I call it whatever, tragic events, conflict, suffering.
Let's open up the lens of the camera a little bit wider and have you tell us how far back in history before the events of 94 years ago do you think we need to go in order to understand the picture more completely?
Okay. Well, let's look at back from the 14th century maybe, or the Armenians, the Ottoman Empire had this millet system where they gave all the ethnic communities their freedom of religion. And Armenians were, lived together within the Ottoman Empire at least 400 years before these events happened. And they were in fact called what's Milleti Sadıka, which means the loyal millet, the most privileged of all the ethnic communities. Until in the late 19th century was when British and the Russians start meddling in the Ottoman Empire affairs. And you might remember or know the term sick man of Europe. That's what Ottoman Empire was called at that time by the Russian Tsar. And there's a famous story happening that he indicated to George Hamilton about the sick man of Europe is slipping out of our hands and we have to make the necessary arrangements, which means, partitioning and the land. And to accomplish that, they started agitating the ethnic groups, including, the Slavic ones in the Balkans and Armenians in the Caucasus, which then led to the formation of some Armenian terrorist organizations like Hunchak and Dashnak. And then the opportune time was the First World War. Now, the events we're talking about that the Armenians called genocide, which is April 24th, 1915, let's put it into a little bit of broad perspective in a historical context. It's in the middle of First World War. The Ottoman Empire, starting with November of 1914, the British were occupying Basra and moving from the south to Baghdad, which were today's Iraq, but it was Ottoman Empire at that time. So the empire was being occupied from the south. And on the east, the Russians started advancing. And on the west in 1915, people might know as the Gallipoli Wars, the naval attack to the Dardanelles area started, the British and Allied forces, ending with the wars of Gallipoli. So within that context, with the agitation of Russians, Armenia starts rebelling.
And you're going to forgive me if I nudge you along here, because time is always the enemy in television. Is it your view that Armenia made common cause with Russia against the Ottoman Empire, and therefore that's why Ottomans at the time targeted Armenians as they did?
Well, yes. And the decision that was taken, the significance of April 24th, 1915 date was the date the Interior Ministry of the Ottoman Empire sent a circular to the governors of the areas in the eastern province where Armenians were rebelling, basically to arrest the leaders of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation and to close, the branches and the head office. The relocation order came about a month later. Eventually, they decided to relocate the Armenians in that area to other parts.
Why did they do that?
Well, because this was the war area. And
But were Armenians not seen as, I mean, well, you just said it, they were always seen as loyal citizens within the empire before that.
But that was until 1860s or 70s. From
so that
then
changed
on,
everything.
That changed everything, and there was a lot of Armenian attack and rebellions in villages. And the Armenian chiefs indicated that were in the Russian army that there were at least 120,000 Armenians that were within the Russian army. Russian soldiers were Armenians.
Were there also not Armenians in the Ottoman Empire
Sure,
army?
that's right.
There were.
But when these relocation orders were given, none of the Armenians in the western provinces, in the bigger cities, were touched. In fact, the foreign ministry of the Ottoman Empire was an Armenian at that time. So this cannot be an intent to destroy a nation or a religious or an ethnic group. It's just relocation of the Armenians that are agitating in the war area.
In which case, give us your understanding of how you believe the hundreds of thousands, some say more than 1 million Armenians died at the time.
Well, that number of Armenians died as well as the Turks. A couple of reasons. One, during the relocation, now you have to understand the context again. This is wartime, and in 1915 we don't have the transportation means of that time. There's famine, there's disease, plus there were attacks by certain revenge attacks by Turkish or Kurdish tribes of all the things that were happening at that time. That's why I'm calling it's happening both sides, and there were tragic events that we have to analyze and learn from it. But trying to calling it a genocide with really political declarations shuts up the debate.
Okay, I'm going to get to that in 1 second, but intent is clearly a key word here.
Sure.
What do you believe the intention of Armenians today is in calling this a genocide, if in your view it wasn't?
The intent is clear. The Armenians themselves indicate the famous 3 words: recognition, restitution, reparation. That's the slogan of Armenian Revolutionary Federation. The declaration of independence of today's Armenia includes lands in other country. Eastern Turkey is Western Armenia.
So you believe they still have designs on that land?
Oh, I still believe, and I'll tell you, as recent as 2 years, as you know, in every year, April 24, there's demonstrations in Ottawa in front of the Turkish embassy. I have the newspaper cutouts of placards in front of Ottawa in the year 2000, still calling Eastern Turkey is Western Armenia.
And you think they still want reparations as well?
Sure. And again, I can show you, I have it even here, some information bulletins in California where they're organizing meetings in 2006, as if these naming certain provinces in eastern Turkey, like Van, Erzurum, Kars, and indicating what they will do when they get it. I mean, this is an active dream, and it's going on.
How widespread do you think that part of the dream is within the Armenian community? I mean, there's always some people
Sure.
who will hold out these views, but is it widespread?
I hope it is not, and I know that there are, obviously, Armenian community is divided as any other community. There are Armenians from Lebanon, Egypt, and there are a lot of Armenians here from Turkey, which are a very good friend of mine. There are a lot of musical and cultural activities that the Turkish community does together with the Armenians from Turkey. There are Armenians living in Turkey right now with a large number, but there is a very active, radical element of the Armenian diaspora who's really doing most of the political...
Well, why would they care? They don't even live there. They live here.
Well, that's exactly what our point is. This issue should be left between Republic of Turkey and Armenia to deal. They are already talking about dealing with the border issues. I mean, as you know, President Obama was in Turkey just about a month ago, or less than a month ago.
Yeah.
That's right, and with the encouragement of them and the Swiss government, there's negotiations going on. This has to be tied out with the Nagorno-Karabakh withdrawal, the occupied land from Azerbaijan. But that should be left between the two countries, not the Armenian diaspora in Canada or in the U.S.
Now I want to follow up on this notion of genocide and whether this is or whether this isn't in your view. And here, according to the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, are the key ingredients, the key factors that have to be in place to be able to use the word genocide. Let's bring these up if we can. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Now, given that description, how do the events of 94 years ago not meet that test in your view?
If you look at all these four groups you identified, you notice the absence of political groups there. And that was deliberately taken from that decision. And the Dashnaks and the Hunchaks were political groups fighting for the independence of Armenia, carving it out from the Ottoman lands with the encouragement of British and Russians. During wartime, there is not even a resemblance of intending to destroy a national, racial or ethnic group.
But you call them a political group. They're clearly an ethnic group, as well as with political aspirations, maybe.
Sure, but you have to also understand one thing. The wartime propaganda and the missionary activities have tremendous effects on this. Obviously, the Britain were trying to get the U.S. into the war, into the First World War, and there were a tremendous amount of Protestant missionary activities in the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions in 1920s, during those years, during the World War, collected $116 million in the United States, which is by far the largest private charity donation affair, all by giving the notion that Muslims are slaughtering Christians. And obviously that creates tremendous reaction and the money is pouring. So the evidence that is put in for genocide, majority of it is coming from these Protestant missions. Now, I want to bring up two things very important. One is we have to look at what the Armenian leaders of that time who lived through it are saying. And two very important evidences. One is Bogos Nubar, who is the president of the Armenian delegation to the Paris Peace Conference after the war in 1919. And he wrote a letter to the French minister, Stéphane Pichon, French foreign minister at that time, in December 1918, in order to be accepted to the Paris Peace Conference at a delegation, indicating how Armenians were de facto belligerents, how they assisted the Russians, how they fought with the French uniform against the Turkey.
And what was the response from France?
Sorry?
What was the response from France?
I don't know what the response from France was. At the end, they were not accepted as delegations, but that letter is an evidence. It's on. This is from an Armenian chief of the delegation in 1918 saying this. Another one is the first prime minister of the independent Armenia, Hovhannes Khochaznuni, in 1923, what he said in the Congress of the Armenian Revolution Federation. It's a masterpiece indicating how they assisted 150,000 Armenians with Russian uniforms fighting against Turks, 40,000 of them with French uniforms fighting against Turks. I mean, these are words of Armenian leaders at that time.
Okay, but comment on this then. I think most people remember Adolf Hitler's famous line, which is, of course we can get away with the Holocaust against the Jews because who remembers the genocide against the Armenians, and at that time it was only 20 years prior.
Do you want my reaction to it?
Yeah.
Sure, that gives me pause, because that is one of the fallacies, propaganda by Armenians. Hitler never said those words. It has been scholarly, I can show you a lot of scholarly evidence, document studies, that this is totally false.
He never said that.
He never said that, and how this is being propagandized by Armenians. And it is so interesting that every year when there's a debate in the Canadian Parliament or US Parliament, every politician that comes up says those words, as if it's a fact. It is not a fact, it's been proven to be false, but it is a very powerful tool because it ties it to the Jewish Holocaust. And obviously to get that sympathy, the Jewish Holocaust is there, obviously it's a fact, and it's been tried. There's the Nuremberg trials that established that fact. There has never been a trial for the Armenian genocide. In fact, the one biggest attempt to do this was between 1918 and 1921, the Malta trials, where Istanbul was the capital of the Ottoman Empire, was occupied by the British at that time. With all the, obviously, Armenian lobbying efforts, they arrested 140 high-ranking Ottoman officials and ministers, brought them to Malta, the island of Malta. And for 2.5 years, they searched evidence in the archives of the Ottoman Empire, which they were under their control in Istanbul, in London,
and it was
in Washington. It was no evidence, and they released all these people. No, there was not even an evidence that started a court of trial.
In fairness, that took place before the UN declaration of what constitutes genocide had been created.
Sure, that's right. But I mean, for crimes against humanity or crimes against Armenians, obviously the word of genocide wasn't there at that time.
I understand the word genocide raises a lot of red flags in the Turkish community. Would you be prepared to say, yes, the Ottoman Empire is guilty of having perpetrated acts that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not more than 1 million Armenians?
Well, if you call the decision, well, obviously there was a decision of relocation given by the Ottoman Empire, which caused a lot of effects that's happening. Whether they directly indicated that to happen is another matter. In fact, there's also a lot of evidence that they specifically indicated to the governors of the areas to to assist the relocation orders. But obviously there was no law and order in the middle of war in such an era, and things broke up, and these things happened. We acknowledge those suffering and deaths.
Let me ask you another question that I asked Mr. Babikian, which is, the people responsible for this obviously are dead today. It wasn't even Turkey back then. It was the Ottoman Empire. Exactly. Different country, different standards, different. I mean, everything compared to today is different. Now Turkey's trying to get welcomed into the Western family of nations. And yet there is still to this day, even though there isn't that direct link, I think it's fair to say, a defensiveness among Turks that this be called one thing, not another. Why are Turks still so defensive about this?
Well, they're defensive because their death is not acknowledged, as if it doesn't matter. I mean, the West always hears about Armenian genocide, quote, quote, Armenians. You know, the numbers increased tremendously up to, millions, yet nobody talks about the deaths of Turks.
If Turkish deaths were acknowledged by the other side, would Turks be prepared to acknowledge there was a genocide?
No, not a genocide, but Turks always acknowledge that hundreds and thousands of Armenians died and they suffered losses. That's a tragedy. These events happened. They're a tragedy. Let's learn how did it happen, why it happened, and so that they won't happen again. But calling it genocide, and especially in political arenas, is not the solution. I mean, the Prime Minister of Turkey just suggested this 4 years ago, a joint historical commission by Armenian and Turkish historians, as well as third parties, and still not being accepted by the Armenians. Turks opened the archives, but the archives in Armenia and the archives of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation in Boston are not being opened. So let's have a scholarly debate rather than a political debate.
In this country, earlier in this decade, on a few occasions, I know a couple of provinces did it and then the Canadian Parliament did it, resolutions were passed stating that what took place 94 years ago was genocide. What's your view on those parliamentary resolutions?
Most probably within the next 3 or 4 days, on April 24, President Obama is obviously, as every year, he has to make a statement. Everybody is watching to see if he's going to use the word genocide or not. And if he says genocide, does it mean that now it is genocide? Because President Obama said...
Well, when he was there, he didn't use it. When he was in Turkey, he wouldn't use the word.
That's right. But I mean, what I'm saying is whether he uses it or not, politicians don't know about the issues, don't care about the issues. They have their own agendas. Which is get elected and obviously campaign donations and their own interests.
So this was designed to curry favor with the Armenian community?
Yes, it was. I mean, I don't believe that there are a large number of Canadian politicians in the year 2009 that care about what happened 90 years ago in Eastern Anatolia, or they know about it. But there's obviously other dynamics in there.
How many Turkish Canadians today?
In Canada?
Yeah.
About 40,000.
So it's half as big as the Armenian community.
Yeah, but also half as powerful because Armenia has been there for 90 or 100 years, and obviously they're much more well established and organized and economically powerful also.
So tell me, how does all of this discussion about genocide and what comes up every year on the 24th of April, how does this affect the Turkish-Canadian community?
It affects obviously being labeled as sort of descendants from people who perpetrated genocide, and we see this all the time. Our children at schools see this all the time. They've been attacked. Their cultural functions have been attacked. Their conferences are silenced, people involved. And this is not really what should happen in a multicultural environment like Canada.
I wonder if part of the problem, though, is that, and help me with this, because I've heard Armenians say that it is illegal in Turkey today to discuss this issue, that you know, it's very problematic to have conferences. There's kind of an official government position on what did or didn't take place, and anybody who tries to sort of buck the conventional position on this runs great risks in Turkey.
No, there is no such thing. There's obviously in Turkey, there are nationalist groups that are very radical as any country, but it is not illegal to discuss this. From time to time, depending on the policies, you know, one side goes some other measures or not, but it is never illegal. In fact, there are so many conferences being done in Turkey to discuss this. It's being written in the papers. It is not illegal, but it wasn't really an issue. I learned about all these issues in 1973, or between 70 and 70 when I was in California. In Turkey, I had a lot of Armenian friends. The only thing I thought different in them was their names. For me, they sounded weird.
But there,
that's all.
There have been journalists in Turkey who've been put in prison for writing about this, though. That is true. I mean, they're not completely without foundation when they say it's risky to discuss.
Well, it may be risky depending on certain government politicians, but it is not illegal to discuss Armenian issue. There are certain times, depending on certain words, yes, they interpret the Constitution differently.
But it may not be illegal, but if you end up in jail, it's certainly ill-advised, isn't it?
Well, maybe ill-advised, but academicians do it all the time.
Okay. Again, Mr. Babikian argued that by refusing to use the word genocide, Turks are not just hurting Armenians, they are also hurting themselves. And here's his reasoning, and I want to get your comment on this. He would say that by not coming to terms with Turkey's own history, and by being unwilling or unable to engage in a real serious national debate within Turkey about the events of 94 years ago, it hurts Turkey's domestic development, democratic development, and the willingness of the rest of the Western world to embrace Turkey, which at the end of the day, he would say, is bad for Turkey. Is that true?
No, that's what Armenians want everybody to believe, especially Mr. Babikian. In fact, I will turn his question to him. Armenians don't want the debate because they stifle debate. In a lot of countries, they passed or attempted, some countries in Europe they did, and even here they attempted to pass laws indicating that it is illegal to deny genocide. So for them, this is a fact. There's nothing to dispute, nothing to discuss, and if you deny it, it's illegal. And there are so many non-Turkish independent third-party scholars, I can name 20 of them at least, that were silenced, that were bombed, their house, and their conferences was attacked, like Bernard Louis, Stanford Shaw.
Okay, but you know that there's this new list that's come out, a bunch of Turkish scholars who have said, yes, it was a genocide, and they signed their name.
Well, so let's have a debate.
So have a debate, okay.
Exactly.
I got a couple of minutes left here. Let me raise one more thing with you. This is obviously, this issue has been around for a long time, almost a century. And I wonder if you think there's anything that you feel could be done to ease the tension and enhance the potential amity between your two societies.
Sure I do. And in fact, going back to 1995, at that time, several terms, but I was the president of the Federation of Canadian Turkish Associations. And you know, Mr. Sarkis Asadurian, who's an MP, who was an MP of Armenian descent and was recently elected, we met with him, some members of our community, and there's a letter that I wrote as the president of the Federation, and the whole idea was to get together the Armenian community here and the Turkish community and start a dialogue. So we're in Canada, these events do not belong to Canada.
How'd that go? How did those efforts go?
Nothing. About 4 months after repeated letters, he came and said he cannot get the Armenian community to meet with Turks. Same thing happened, attempted again, my second term of presidency, which was in 2004, met with another prominent Armenian community leader who was willing to do, but he came, he says, we cannot bring the Armenian community to meet with Turks. I believe their hatred of Turks is their raison d'etre. You know, there are a lot of Armenian friends that I have, mostly from the Armenians from Turkey, but maybe there are other groups that are blocking it. Surely we should have a debate. We have so much in common, our food, our culture, our music, you know, anything other than maybe religion is common. There are a lot of commonality there. Let's emphasize those, get together, and then once the dialogue starts, maybe we can agree or disagree, agree to disagree, do something about it. But these kind of political lobbying efforts, whether it's genocide or not, is not really akin to the peaceful existence of different communities in a multicultural society.
Mr. Delen, we're very grateful you could come in tonight and share your views on this very problematic subject. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.